Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And congratulations, Eric, on this extraordinary book. One of the things I'm most excited about with this book is the degree of collaboration and community engagement that you put forward in this book. And it's the kind of thing that's really important here at the Newberry Library's work. And I wonder if you can start us off by telling us a bit about the origin of this project and your relationship with the community that prompted it.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for asking, and thanks everybody for being here this evening. This picture was taken what feels like a lifetime ago when I gave a talk at the Meskwaki Tribal Museum on the Meskwaki settlement. If anybody is not familiar, if you were to get in your car and drive 4 hours straight west of here, you'd be at the Meskwaki settlement, a sovereign land base of the Meskwaki Nation in central Iowa, just outside of Des Moines. And when I was a new graduate student at the University of Iowa in about 2011, born and raised in the Black Hills, I wanted to do work for my master's thesis that was about federal policy as it related to Native people and land issues as a way of understanding my own home community and kind of the tensions that are omnipresent there. And so I made some connections through my advisor and a dear friend of mine, Mary Bennett, who worked at the State Historical Society, who offered to drive me out to the settlement. And there I met Jonathan Buffalo, who's at the far left, Mary Youngbear in the middle, who did the cover art on the book and some cool icons in there that you'll see, and many other folks. And when we were just getting started, they were in the process of converting an old BIA building, a Bureau of Indian Affairs building, into the Tribal Museum. And they saw me and they said, "You look like a guy who can reach the ceiling." And I said, "Okay." And so they had me help paint the ceiling of the museum. So over the course of several weeks, we collaborated in that way, and I volunteered largely in the spirit of what was in Haku's and the Newberry's land acknowledgement, this idea of reciprocity. As a non-Native person, it's very important to me that I approach this work with a sense of humility and respect. And so I went and just spent time getting to know people in the community before one day I finally said to Jonathan, you know a little bit about me. What's a project that I could do for my thesis that would be useful for the community? And he thought for a while and he said, people in our community talk a lot about our tribal constitution, which is created in the 1930s, but people don't really know where it came from. If you could do some work that helped explain that, that would be very helpful to us. And so that's what I did. I wrote a master's thesis about the tribal constitution of the 30s. Turns out in order to understand what the community was debating in the 30s, you had to understand the unique status of their land, which we'll talk more about tonight. And that's what kind of got the ball rolling on what became a dissertation and then the project. But these connections with you are fundamental to the process, and these folks were all collaborators who I'm deeply grateful to. It's really an extraordinary story of survival and resurgence, and all Native histories have these awful low points and histories of violence to contend with. And in the 18th century, the Fox Wars are particularly devastating for Meskwaki people. And I'm wondering if you could walk us through that history of the challenges that it presents. Of course. So anybody who's not familiar with Sac and Meskwaki people and their history, the word Meskwaki itself translates to people of the Red Earth, which is where the title of the book and the term Red Earth people comes from. And so according to their origin stories, Meskwaki people are originally from the Red Earth or the soil of Quebec, Canada, not originally from the Midwest. And there's this oral tradition that is about an arrow that gets shot by a spirit being that leads the people to the West. And one of the things I wanted to do in the early part of the book was align Meskwaki oral traditions and their own understanding of their history with what the Western intellectual tradition, archaeologists and historians in the documentary record tell us. And one of the things that you find is they actually overlap very well. So you can follow that arrow, as it were, from Quebec all the way out to the Midwest into central Iowa, where the Meskwaki Nation ultimately landed on its settlement. And along that journey, there was some pretty intense violence between a lot of Native nations. But the Meskwaki Nation was nearly annihilated in what were known as the Fox Wars, which were basically violence over access to beaver trapping territory. And the French king, along with some Native communities that were aligned with the French at that time, it got to the point by around 1730 or so, where there were only 200 Meskwaki people alive, and about half of them were enslaved. And so the survivors of the Fox Wars allied with Sauk's. This is why you get Sac and Fox, those two names spoken together. And they traveled together through the Great Lakes into Illinois and Iowa, and then later on separate. But that's kind of the early history that helps you understand.
I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how that relationship comes together.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way, again, not being a Meskwaki person or a Sauk person, but talking to a lot of folks from those communities, they talk a lot about being relatives, right? So the Sauk and Meskwaki Nations, these are groups of people who spent a lot of time together. They had very similar cultural traditions, languages, economies, things like that. And so they're very aligned. But there was also a degree of separation, right? So even when you get later into the 1700s, 1800s, here in Iowa and Illinois, basically the two communities would separate their villages. So Sauk people would be in one village and then Meskwaki people on the other side of the river. So even though they're closely aligned with one another, there is this kind of awareness within the community that even though they're allies and relatives and members of both communities intermarry with one another, they're still two separate nations who are traveling together. And that's, fundamental to understanding the story because it helps us later understand why they went their separate ways and undertook different strategies as time went on.
And at the heart of this whole story is an 1857 purchase of the Meskwaki settlement. And it stands out as very unique. And I'm wondering if you could talk our audience through a sense of understanding what's so unique about it and the wider history of removal pressures.
Sure. Before we get there, to the next slide, that is, this map that's up over my left shoulder here is just a kind of quick overview of the various treaties between 1804 and 1842 that systematically dispossessed Sauk and Meskwaki people of all their land in what is now Illinois and Iowa, right? And people, in this room and watching will be familiar with the history of Indigenous removal, right? It is sort of fundamental to the story of westward expansion and the creation of the United States. And there's a lot of scholarship and work that has focused on this, and rightly so, right? Several major books, even in the last few years, Claudio Sant's book, others have talked about this phenomenon and really explored it and probed it. And again, for good reason, it's something we should continue to research and learn more about the different dimensions of that story. But I'll actually put it back on Doug for a second. He was kind enough to read an early draft of my manuscript while I was getting my book in process towards publication. And I don't know if you remember saying this, Doug, but you read it and you said, the Meskwaki story feels like reading Native history in reverse, right? So in other words, we're all used to these stories where all the maps show tribal land shrinking over time, right? And as the United States expands westward or up from the southwest, tribal land bases diminish. And the story of the Meskwaki settlement, which they purchased in 1857, is this remarkable story of a tribal land base expanding outward over the last 160 years. So if you look up in the middle of that map over my shoulder, that green rectangle in the middle, that's the original 80-acre settlement purchase. So in the summer of 1857, the Meskwaki Nation sent 5 diplomats, Meskwaki men, to the doorstep of an Iowa farmer and asked if they could they could purchase some land. And the community had pooled together $1,000 from annuity payments and arts and crafts sales and things like that. And they offered $1,000 to this farmer, bought 80 acres of land. And then over the next year or so, about 250 Meskwaki people moved up and lived on that parcel. And over the last 160 years, that has expanded out to over 8,000 acres of land that the tribe owns communally and has rebuilt their story on. So the kind of cornerstone point of the whole book is this exploration of what it meant for a community to purchase land in that way and to rebuild its community politically, economically, culturally, in the face of, a broader national story of the collapse of Indigenous populations, which overlays with the loss of native land.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about, why this particular site and how the community ends up determining this particular site.
Yeah. There's a couple of answers to that. One is when you talk to Meskwaki folks, there are a couple cultural stories or oral traditions within the community about why this particular place was selected. I did my very best in the book to relay the fact that there was cultural meaning here without crossing a boundary and, sharing things that I thought were inappropriate for a non-native author to share. There's a couple stories that had been published elsewhere, and I kind of got authorization from the community to share. And so that's a component of it. But the other piece of it, again, sort of working on aligning the Meskwaki and Western worldviews to help tell the story, there is a cultural answer and stories that talk about why this particular bend in the river where they purchased their land mattered to the community. But it was also a carbon copy of an ecosystem that the community had been able to survive on for several generations, right? So when you go back through even general land office surveys talking about the quality of the soil and what kind of trees and what kind of flora and fauna are available, this is a landscape that could support the kind of economy that Meskwaki people had in the generations before removal. And so they intentionally came back to this place, trying to mirror other places where they had been successful and been able to find, respite in generations of challenge and collapse. And this was it. So they picked it, bought it intentionally, and then rebuilt from there. And the community, survived and now thrives and did that place.
And there's a really interesting backstory to the political configuration of the tribe itself and the making of this historical alliance and relationship into something called the Sac and Fox tribe, which is something of a legal fiction that has real consequences for people's treaty rights. And I wonder if you can explain that element of the history.
Sure. I'll go back one slide. So I don't know if this has a laser pointing on it, but if you look, basically the 1804 treaty is the one that was the first treaty that kind of started the collapse of South Meskwaki control of their land in what was Illinois and Iowa along the Mississippi River. And the 1804 treaty was this really, remarkable moment, not only because of what it began in terms of these dispossessive treaties, but there was basically an incident of violence that involved allegedly some Sauk men. The U.S. government understood that with all of these local settlers all, whipped up into a frenzy over this incident, that they had a lot of political capital and will to try to impose what became onto this situation. And so what the federal government does is it comes to the treaty table with an attitude of punishment, at the negotiations. And there's also all kinds of spurious things going on with this particular set of negotiations. But what they do is they basically take the Sauk Nation and the Meskwaki Nation, and they say, we're not going to negotiate two treaties with the Sauk Nation and the Meskwaki Nation. We're going to negotiate one treaty with the unified Sauk and Meskwaki Nation, So these two communities who were sovereign, separate, traveled together and were allies, but didn't think of themselves as being one political unit. The federal government forcibly combines them into one tribe because it made it easier to leverage the two communities against one another and get the tribes to sign off on these dispossessive treaties. And in the book, I sort of try to track through the consequences of that. It was over a century before the federal government would recognize the two tribes as being separate and distinct from one another legally. And when you go through the history of each of these successive treaties, there are moments where the federal government will treat with both tribes when it led to both tribes losing land, when there was a different circumstance where there was an opportunity to get more land from one tribe but not the other, they would agree to do separate treaties. So it was very clearly a strategy that was designed at creating, again, this term I use in the book, a legal fiction of unifying these tribes for the express purpose of trying to be able to separate the two politically, to be able to access that land and drive the dispossession of the place.
And another interesting element of the story is the nation's unique allotment history. But before getting into explaining their allotment history, if you could back up a bit and explain some of the legalities for those folks who don't understand, have prior background with it, the nature of trust land, for instance, and what's at stake with these designations.
Sure. So for anybody who's not familiar, and this is a very complicated topic with 200 plus years of capricious policies, contradictory legal precedents, all sorts of things that make this very, very nuanced. But for our purposes tonight, the vast majority of indigenous land that's held on reservations, for example, in the United States, is not owned directly by the tribes, but held in trust, usually by the Department of the Interior for tribes themselves. And so this basically has the overall effect of situating tribal land bases, but also tribal sovereignty within this framework that is, according to federal law, sort of above and separate from states in terms of jurisdiction, but beneath the authority of the federal government. So the federal government, Congress and the Supreme Court controls the land through federal agencies when it's held in trust. And this limits the ability of tribes to be able to do different things with their land base in some cases. But it's also the reason why tribal land sits outside of state jurisdiction, which is what it allows certain things around natural resources or gaming enterprises, economic development involving casinos and that sort of thing. This is why tribes are treated differently in the sort of federal political framework than state land or other privately owned land.
And allotment rears its ugly head, and the community manages to avoid it. But if you could explain the potential of the threat that allotment poses.
Sure. So with everything I mentioned in mind just a moment ago, so as the United States is expanding westward in the 19th century and consolidating its power and control over most of North America, at least in what became the United States, more and more tribes are being forced onto small reservations and confined there, right? But one of the problems from the American point of view, or from the Western point of view, was that tribes' economies were still structured around communal land ownership. And so by the 1880s, the federal government came up with a policy known as allotment, passed what was called the Dawes Allotment Act. And the Allotment Act basically took, if a piece of land, like a reservation, and then carved it up and checkerboarded it. And the idea was they would mirror the logic of the Homestead Act by giving Indigenous families a parcel of land to farm on, own individually, and settle there, right? And then any of the surplus land, the land that was left over, would be sold off to settlers. And this is how reservation lands across the United States got checkerboarded. And even though there's an external boundary or an outer boundary of a reservation, the interior of that is certain parcels belong to the tribe, certain parcels belong to individual tribal members, and in a lot of cases, big chunks of reservation land actually belong to non-native people who bought that land over the years, right? Allotment robbed Native nations of something like 90 million acres of land between 1887 and 1934 when the allotment policy was stopped. So it was extremely devastating. But the Meskwaki settlement, because the tribe purchased it over the years and expanded it from that 80 acres forward and was able to leverage itself politically against the federal government, saying, no, we bought this land ourselves, you can't do this to us. They're one of the few tribes in the United States who was able to stave off allotment. And even though there were numerous attempts over many decades, and it came close a few times, the settlement to this day is 100% tribally owned, communally owned, and was never allotted. And so it offers not only a model of what it looks like when tribes reclaim their land through direct purchase, it stands as kind of a historical case study for what can happen when tribes' land was not allotted at all, right? And they were able to control it throughout that whole stretch of time.
And in addition to allotment, which the community manages to avoid through this novel legal status, by the 1930s, there are a new set of challenges that the community is facing in regards to governance through the Indian Reorganization Act. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about, as we shift from the generation of allotment and assimilation and the pressures of that era to what the 1930s looks like for Meskwaki folks.
Absolutely. Before I jump to matters of governance, one of the things that I think is important to sort of say, and one of the points I try to make in the book is, why is tribal land ownership important, right? And this graph that I have up on the left here, I think is the best illustration in the book of the answer to that question. And what you see is that the highest oral history estimates of Meskwaki population say that there were something like 22,000 Meskwaki people as of the year 1600. Western documents and stuff say it's more like 4,000 or 5,000. But one of the things we know is that over the last 400 years, the Meskwaki Nation's population has only grown 2 times, and both times was when the tribe had a strong foothold of land that it controlled in what we now know as Iowa or the Midwest, right? So in other words, you can overlay demographic collapse through violence, disease, and all of these things with the taking of native land, and what you see from that is a pretty basic answer, which is that when tribes have land, they are more successful, and so are their neighbors, by the way, the non-native communities around them. And so basically land ownership, fundamentally a good thing, and that's what you see in this chart as the population declines and then grows when the tribe has its property. But the second piece of it that complicates it is, to Doug's question, land ownership is fundamental and vital to tribes and their success, but it's not a silver bullet. It is contested at every stage, right? So the context of a moment, the political context of a moment matters a lot because tribes have to both have land and then navigate these complicated legal systems and political situations to be able to leverage their authority over that land in order to make the community successful. And so it is not a straightforward story of get land, everything's better. It is get land and you have an anchor point from which to survive, but you also have to be working against these major political currents of various things that are going on. And so one of the things I try to do in the book, and I'll get to the question about the 1930s in just a second here, is talk about things like boarding schools and assimilation policies that tried to force Meskwaki people to assimilate, right? There are many instances in which Meskwaki people are successful because of their land ownership in part and because of the tenacity of the community in resisting things like allotment and those kinds of programs. There are also cases where the Meskwaki Nation didn't necessarily win per se, right? The federal government did build a boarding school and force children to go there. The Meskwaki Nation ultimately got it closed, but there's a long, period in there where they're wrestling against these issues. There's also a period in 1901, 1902, where there's a smallpox outbreak on the settlement, and the federal government and the state combined together, put the entire settlement under quarantine, and then burn the village that the community was living in, right? And so this is an example of the sort of waning power of the Meskwaki Nation, politically speaking, despite its land ownership, right? And so one of the things I try to do is walk through these different periods and talk about how settlement helped the tribe maintain authority over its land base in certain cases. In other cases, it diminished. But by the 1930s, when the federal government came forward with what was known as the Indian New Deal or the Indian Organization Act, there's a whole new suite of opportunities that allow the community to test its powers over its land base using the new framework that's brought in around FDR's New Deal, right? And so, in other words, what you end up having is this really kind of tense and contested period where Meskwaki political power and powers of self-governance over the settlement are kind of waning at the end of the 19th and in the early part of the 20th century. But then by the 1930s, there's a whole new set of opportunities through a tribal constitution and different federal programs to reassert some of that authority and start rebuilding back the political power that they'd lost over the decades that preceded.
And in terms of some of those federal programs, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about some of the interplay between tribal autonomy and federal programs, particularly through the CCC, for instance, and that a range of New Deal programs that were newly available.
Yeah, it's a great question. You'll remember from the top of our discussion that Jonathan, when he first asked me or told me the work that might be useful to the community, it was this question of the tribal constitution. So part of the Indian New Deal was the federal government coming to tribes and saying, a way for you to reformulate your system of governance would be to have a Western-style democratic constitution that the tribe would adopt and then elect a council and sort of mirror the United States government, right? And so there are ways in which this was highly controversial in its time and still today, right? A lot of tribes say we had systems of governance, council systems, consensus-based governance that predated the United States by thousands of years. So we didn't need this to be imposed on us. And that was certainly a sentiment on the settlement and all across the United States when this came out. But the Meskwaki Nation did, after a fairly contentious set of elections, choose to create one of these constitutions in the 1930s. And then one of the things that I think was interesting about the Meskwaki story is, rather than engaging closely as a historian with the kind of politics of why they chose that path, to explore what that path meant for the community. And one of the answers was that with this new tribal constitution and with this newly elected tribal government, the Meskwaki Nation could contract with the federal government through programs like the CCCID or the Civilian Conservation Corps Indian Division. And what did they do? They took the newly kind of, new respect for tribal sovereignty and governance that was happening in that era, federal dollars and resources around Great Depression relief, and they invest back in strengthening the settlement as a land base. So there's a dimension to the story that is about kind of the environmental history of the settlement and how the community at every turn is not only using money to try to buy more land and navigating these different contentious political moments, but wherever they can, investing resources into infrastructure projects, forestry projects, all kinds of those kinds of things, to be able to strengthen the settlement as an environment and a land base that would be able to take care of the community, both from a sort of cultural standpoint and an infrastructure standpoint, but also from an economic development standpoint later into the 20th century.
And one of the many ways in which the story resonates, across a handful of different subfields and topics in Native American history, is that this is also an important story of casino gaming. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the community's background in that regard.
Sure. Great to see. Yeah. So one of the really sort of remarkable things to kind of stitch in part of the story that we're talking about and that Doug was asking about is that in the 1930s, there's this resurgence of Meskwaki political authority and a sense of autonomy and control over the settlement in this period surrounding the creation of the Constitution, the New Deal, and that sort of thing. One of the challenges the community faced was that the economy on the settlement was in pretty bad shape for decades, right? So I think by, off the top of my head, by the early 1950s, the unemployment rate in Iowa as a whole was like 4 or 5%, and on the settlement it was more like 30 or 40%, right? So entrenched unemployment, poverty, these kinds of challenges faced the community. And so what happens is by the 1940s, with the dawn of World War II, there's all kinds of new wartime industry, opportunities for members of the Meskwaki Nation to serve in the military, to go to nearby towns in Wisconsin and in Illinois and other parts of Iowa to work in factories and things like that. And this inspires probably the first young generation of Meskwaki people to not look and rely on the settlement for their economic base and sustenance, but to go out, right? And so in the story, you have this pretty, I think, classic dynamic that would play out in any community, where there's older generations of people saying, all of our kids are leaving, our community is going to fall apart, what's going to happen here? And you have young people saying, well, we want to go out and experience the world and have new jobs and education opportunities, this kind of thing, right? And for several decades, the Meskwaki Nation experiments with off-settlement wage work, right? So for decades, we were on the settlement, making it go, making everything happen. But circumstances changed after the war, and we believe there's more opportunity. There's federal programs, relocation, and all these other things that are incentivizing Native people across the country, but certainly on the settlement, to go elsewhere, right? But what ends up happening is by the late 60s, the Meskwaki settlement and the Meskwaki Nation's economic position has not improved. What Meskwaki people find when they go work in Milwaukee or Council Bluffs or somewhere in the region is that because of discrimination, they're last hired, first fired, right? And so there's this entrenched sense that if the community is to survive as a nation, as a whole, we need to reinvest in an on-settlement economy that can take care of all Meskwaki people. And there's documents in the 1960s and 1970s as the Tribal Council saying this, right? So long before the dawn of tribal gaming as we know it, which came in the 1980s and into the 1990s because of Supreme Court cases and things like that, the Meskwaki Nation is already heavily focused on trying to invest back on the settlement to build this on-settlement economy, to recruit young people back and to sustain the community, right? What they couldn't have known when they were making these plans was that tribes elsewhere in the United States would challenge the federal paradigm, use that trust status, use the Supreme Court to launch gaming enterprises, right? And so the Meskwaki Nation, like several tribes throughout the United States in the 1980s, starts a bingo gaming initiative, makes some money off of that, decides to expand that into a casino operation with a hotel and a resort and all this stuff. And within several years, the Meskwaki Nation goes from this place that had been, racked with generational, poverty and entrenched unemployment to far and away the most cash-rich and largest employer in Tama County, right? And so by the 1980s and 1990s, the community is reinvesting in place in that way. And using those dollars to then diversify and use the upfront cash from gaming to launch Meskwaki Inc., which is a very diversified economic development engine that basically runs business interests of the tribe in a variety of different industries, right? And so they've expanded the settlement through the accumulation of dollars that they get through this economic development, which allows them to buy more land, makes them more economically successful and stronger, which then strengthens their political position in contests with state agencies or the federal government, and reifies this idea of sovereignty and creates all these opportunities for self-determination for the tribe and for the Meskwaki people themselves. So it's just this remarkable story of economic recovery in the face of all these broader challenges.
Another way it fits into the broader historical conversation is in regards to land back movements. And I wonder if you might share with us, well, first, for audience members who aren't familiar with the land back movement, one thing I would say is that this book is a really essential title for us to wrap our minds around that history, which is beginning to gain traction in a variety of places. And if you could tell us a bit about this wider movement that's going on and how you see your book fitting into those conversations.
Yeah, so for anybody who isn't familiar, over the last 5-10 years or so, this movement known as land back has been kind of proliferating. As I say, as all things must in the 2020s, it has a hashtag, right? So hashtag land back is a thing. That kind of idea and brand was created by an Indigenous-led philanthropic organization that happens to be based in my hometown, called Indian Collective. And when, where I'm from in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and where I was teaching when I finished the book, the University of Montana, land back is kind of common parlance, and there's, people just write land back on buildings and billboards and things. It's kind of become this symbol of tribal land reclamation. I'm sure people in this room or watching the live stream have seen headlines in the last few years from coast to coast. Every couple months, it seems like there's a tribe purchasing land, getting land donated to them, getting land back through a lawsuit, getting land back through some mechanism, right? And so this thing is taking off and accelerating in the 2020s. But it's only part of this much deeper and I think understudied and overlooked history of tribal land reclamation throughout the United States. The earliest case of tribal land reclamation that I've found in my research was the Santa Ana Pueblo in 1709. So before the United States existed, there's a group of folks in what became New Mexico, Indigenous folks in the Santa Ana Pueblo, buying back Spanish land grants from Hispano settlers, right? And then there's examples of this that go forward all the way up to and including the Meskwaki story and forward, right? So as we think together about what tribal land reclamation means, these kinds of histories like the settlement and its story help us understand both what we mean by land back and its potential today, but also help us look for case studies and different models of what tribes have been doing for centuries to try to reclaim, restore, and reify their land bases as one avenue towards the restoration and recovery of Native peoples in the face of centuries of all kinds of challenges. So I think that's the most exciting part of their story for me, in addition to getting to know and collaborate with folks, was just tracking that through and being able to offer an example of what could have been, right?
And before turning to audience questions, one of the political stakes of what's going on in your work is in terms of relationships again. And I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about the importance of where the historian's work happens. So by that, I mean, over the last 10 years, you've been teaching in university classrooms, you've been working in public history and museum exhibitions, and currently now in foundation. And I wonder if you can talk to us a bit about the decolonial work of Native American history and those who are trained in the field and the various possibilities of work beyond the academy.
Sure. I mean, I can speak to my experience, which is to say that I've been very fortunate over my relatively short career, the last 10 or 15 years or so, to come in and back out of the academy several times. So I was a graduate student when I was doing this work. I was a consultant for a number of years. I went to Montana and was teaching back in a university setting, and now I work for the Black Hills Area Community Foundation. And one of the reasons that I've kind of come in and out of the academic world is because I think about history as something that is, you know, both a important, rigorous scholarly tradition and discipline, right, an intellectual pursuit, but it is also a tool set that allows us to be thoughtful about the application of the kinds of questions and the kinds of research and the kinds of answers that can actually make our world a more just place and a better place for everybody, right? And so I have tried to, seek out throughout my work opportunities to work with communities and to not just evaluate or analyze history for the sake of supporting a strong thesis, although I hope I do that, right? But also to actualize that and put it into practice in communities to try to come to some constructive solutions to some of the deeply entrenched challenges that communities like mine at home face and communities all across the States.
A great role model for the work of this. I appreciate the audience has questions. Let's just.
Thanks, Liv.
Folks are curious, has the Constitution been amended or changed since 1937?
The Meskwaki Constitution, the question was, if anybody didn't hear, has the Constitution been amended or changed? There have been efforts to amend, reform, in some cases dramatically reform the Meskwaki Constitution every few years since the thing was ratified in 1937. I mean, it is a political document. It is a legal document. It's not unlike the U.S. Constitution in that people are constantly debating it with varying degrees of accuracy around, why things are in there and that sort of stuff. But there are very strong, there's a very strong tradition of kind of push and pull within the community, where every 10 years or so there has been at least one effort to dramatically reform, if not repeal it. And I think it's gone through some changes in terms of how the codified law system works. It's been kind of refined over the years, but the original Constitution from the 1930s stands as the kind of overarching governing document of the tribe, because there has never been a major successful effort to overhaul it in the way that people talk about it. But it's definitely a living, contentious thing into the 2020s.
They're curious too about the nature of, practically speaking, what did your research look like? What are the archival resources like in this particular case? What is it been like working with the community, reception to the project, things of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, the project kind of proceeded not linearly, right? So if you're so inclined to, get a copy and read the book, one of the things I did was try to write it as an accessible chronology, right? So there's a beginning and a middle and an end, and people who write books will tell you that's a good way for an audience member to be able to track a story over time, right? That is not how I wrote the book. So I started in the 1930s and was basically like, well, if you want to understand how the Constitution came to be, you have to understand this 1857 settlement purchase, right? So I go back there, and then the master's thesis is basically 1837 to 1930s. And then for my dissertation, I said, well, what happened after the 1930s? So I went from the 1930s forward up to the present. And then when I was talking about, well, maybe this could be a book, and some people thought it could be, they said, well, how did the tribe lose the land before it purchased it back in the first place, right? So the last piece of research I did was actually exploring in more detail the front part of the story, which was how the tribe came to Iowa, lost the land, and then kind of added that onto the story of the reclamation and moved forward, right? So the sort of, as new questions evolved, I sort of built out what became a very chronological story by answering different questions about how different things related to one another. I was very fortunate throughout the process, as I said before, to have just a lot of really thoughtful, passionate, great collaborators on and near the Meskwaki settlement, tribal members who invited me into their homes, shared stories with me. Jonathan himself is both the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, so his day job is being a historian. He is also the most well-studied and well-read Meskwaki historian as a person, as well as being a cultural leader. His house is like an archive. He has actual archival documents like in his living room, and it drives his wife Sue crazy. But they welcomed me in to look through those. And then, a lot of research here in Chicago at the National Archives in DC, State Historical Society in Iowa have, really deep and rich collections that I was able to get access to and spent years, researching, and then took home and pieced it all together and did the right. So it was a very reciprocal process that evolved a lot over the 13 years I worked on this thing.
A lot of very large formal archives like Newberry and smaller informal institutions in people's homes.
Yep.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about the state of Iowa and its unique history that you were just mentioning, and folks in the audience are curious about the relationship that the nation has with the state of Iowa.
Yeah. I think that these days, at least as, I don't live in Iowa anymore, but I was there for several years in the 2010s when I was in grad school. Compared to other parts of the American West, where I think there is much more tension between state governments and tribal governments, the Meskwaki Nation and the state of Iowa seem to have a very constructive, state level to nation level relationship, and they collaborate a lot on archaeological things, state sort of history and cultural heritage things. The various parks and sort of wildlife management departments, I think, collaborate very closely with the tribe around shared land use on and near the settlement and matter of jurisdiction, right? So it's sort of remarkably healthy these days, but it has, wavered over time. One of the things we didn't have time to talk about this evening was the reason that the Meskwaki settlement was, the reason that the Meskwaki Nation was able to purchase the settlement in the middle of the 19th century in the first place was because the Iowa legislature passed a law formally authorizing the tribe to come back to Iowa, which was not part of the federal government's plan with the treaties that it passed in the 1840s. And then the governor of Iowa himself actually owned the settlement in a state tribal trust for the first 40 years of its existence. So the state of Iowa, as a state political entity, created the kind of layer of political insulation that allowed the tribe to purchase its land in the first place, which was a sort of remarkable thing. By the 1890s, for a variety of reasons, the federal government basically talked Iowa into giving up that state tribal trust and then usurped the settlement as a federal trust. And so after 1896, the federal government's argument is, this is just trust land. It's like reservation land everywhere. You have to listen to us. And the Meskwaki Nation is able to say, well, it's trust land, but we bought it ourselves, and you can't do it to that to us. And so there's this tension that plays forward. But as far as the state goes, there have been different sort of moments of cooperation and other moments of tension.
And there's this history of removal and return to Kansas and back. And folks are curious if you could talk a little bit about that moment in Kansas, and also relationships among multiple communities in the sort of Meskwaki diaspora.
Yeah. So going back to this map from earlier in the discussion, if you follow the kind of arc and migration of Saucon Meskwaki people all the way out to the Midwest, basically what happened was by the 1840s, the federal government had a pretty strong sort of hold, politically speaking, with the power dynamics in the region. And in 1842, finalized the last removal treaty. And that final removal treaty said that on the fall of 1845, all Saucon Meskwaki people had to be out of Iowa forever and removed down to a reservation in Kansas. So today, there are 3 different federally recognized tribes that all bear the name Sac and Fox or Saucon Meskwaki. The Meskwaki Nation in Iowa that the book is about is federally recognized as the Sac and Fox tribe of the Mississippi in Iowa. There is a Sac and Fox tribe down in Oklahoma, and then the Sac and Fox tribe of Kansas, Nebraska. So basically, those are all federally recognized tribes who all share ancestors with the folks who migrated, right? But what happened was that 1842 treaty forcibly removed all of these people onto the reservation that's down along the Osage River in Kansas, what was then known as the Indian Territory. And it was a small group of Meskwaki people, relatively small group of Meskwaki people, were the ones who chose to come back and purchase their land base in Iowa. Some Saucon Meskwaki people decided to stay in Kansas and remain on that reservation, right? And this gets back to one of your early questions about points of tension or agreement or disagreement between the two communities. A lot has been made of the tensions and disagreements around treaty negotiations and the decision to stay or go by historians over the years. one of the things that I chose to emphasize in the scholarship and there in the book was not the points of disagreement between the tribes, but the incredible pressures they were facing, and the fact that whether some Saukar Meskwaki people or families decided to stay in Iowa or stay in Kansas or elsewhere or come back to Iowa, they were all making individual decisions in the moment for what they thought would be the best path forward for their family, right? And I know that even though there's these three separate tribes, and there have been, some disagreements over the years around treaty annuities and things like that, community members still interact with one another, correspond, go visit, participate in cultural things that are more about the unity between them because of their shared ancestry than differences that they may have had over the years, right?
And throughout all of this, the federal government has a heavy hand, and folks are curious, and the audience questions about the degree to which they're involved in the very making of constitutions themselves. Does the federal government play a role in these particular processes, and what does that look like?
In the 1930s, when the federal government came out with what was called, as I mentioned, the Indian Reorganization Act, that was the law that created the basically opportunity or the pathway for tribes to create their own tribal constitution. The federal government had a very prescriptive set of ideas about what these constitutions should look like, right? So people who have been critical of the IRA and these constitutions generally, both academic historians and others, as well as members of Native nations, have pointed out that the federal government kind of came up with a boilerplate and said, here's what you're going to make your government into, right? And there's a criticism there. One of the things I found in my research, and again, this whole project started looking very closely at the Constitution itself, was even though that was true and the BIA did have a pretty aggressive campaign to convince tribes to take on these constitutions and approve them and reformulate their customary systems of governance to follow them, and even though they did have kind of boilerplate material, Meskwaki people and the folks who wrote the Constitution spent a lot of time reformulating that Constitution to meet the needs of their community, right? There's a couple examples in the book I talk about, but the folks who wrote the Constitution went out, had meetings with the community, asked people what they cared about, and there was this kind of dynamic at play that was about the political sort of act and game of making sure the Constitution would fly in the context of the time with the federal government, while also making sure that it met the needs of the Meskwaki Nation as best as they could, while also getting the thing passed, right? Because it was fundamentally a political question of whether or not the community would vote on it. And so that kind of negotiation took place, which is a long way of saying, as I want to do, that the Meskwaki Nation, and I would suspect tribes elsewhere in the United States who created constitutions in the 1930s, had more say in creating the document that governs their community than maybe at the surface at sea.
Okay. There's one particular element of this period in its history that I see on the map here that you can maybe explain to folks in terms of the presence of mixed race reserves, or historically what are sometimes referred to as half-breed tracts, and the way in which that history puts on display varying questions of political sovereignty, but also matters of racial designation and how they intersect. I wonder if you could tell us, just broadly a little bit about that history and how it intersects with.
Yeah, there's a section, I think I have it up here, 1824, the Mixed Race Reserve, which is this kind of dark little corner of Iowa that kind of hangs out right along the Mississippi River there. Basically, again, this gets into the kinds of deep, rigorous scholarship that people like Doug do very well and kind of ask all these questions. And it's why we need more scholarship that probes the kind of nuances of these eras and how it wasn't just about dispossession, but also about racial dynamics and settler expansion and all this different kind of stuff. There was a brief period in the 1820s where basically the question was, as you have Native people being forced off their land and sent down to reservations, and you have non-Native settlers coming in and buying up farmland and settling, what do you do with mixed race families, right? People who had intermarried. And one solution for a brief period there was to create this piece of land that the old-timey textbooks referred to in a more derogatory term, but I call the mixed race reserve. And the idea was that they would have a whole kind of piece of land that was just for these mixed race families to be a part of, right? And then over time that got absorbed by the creation of the state of Iowa, right? And so those kinds of nuances to the story, come out in some of the detail, but not something I emphasize. There's a wonderful dissertation. A gentleman who I want to say was at Iowa State wrote a great dissertation I cited in the book that's all about the mixed race reserve itself. And I just can't think of this gentleman's name off the top of my head, but I would refer anybody who's interested in learning a really, really robust history of it to that work if you want to learn more about it.
Hey. And I don't mean to, ask you a question that sort of is the Meskwaki tourism question, but folks are curious about the community that's not very far away, and people would like to learn more. In addition to picking up your book, will they find museums in Meskwaki Nation, other opportunities for potentially oral histories? What sort of cultural heritage?
Well, there's a number of things you can do. If you're here in Chicago, you can go down to the Field Museum. Doug, you were very involved with the Field Museum's permanent exhibit down there, Indigenous Futures, it's called. What's the name of the exhibit?
Native Truths.
Native Truths, sorry. I had another thing on my mind. You could go learn about there. I know Meskwaki people were very involved with the creation of that. But anybody who hasn't, I would encourage you to go out to the settlement. There is... again, a tribal museum that's wonderful. It's small but mighty. The staff there are great. Folks will tell you all about the story. They'll tell you about the quality of the painting on the ceiling from a decade or more ago. There is the casino itself has really great kind of exhibit space as you sort of walk through the museum. There's big maps that talk about the history of the settlement. But my experience as a general matter has been that the Meskwaki Nation is a remarkably welcoming and hospitable group of people, right? Very open to folks who want to come and learn and be good partners. So if you go there, support the tribe through their various economic development things. They have a gas station there. I always filled up at the Meskwaki settlement before I drove home on tribal land. And also just try to be respectful and thoughtful, understanding that this is their sovereign land and that you're a guest. And I think if you go forth in that spirit and ask good questions, you'll find people more than willing to help you learn about the history of their community, but also the region as a whole in a way that I think is good for everybody and hopefully personally enriching for anybody who does it.
I'm curious too. What is the climate for Meskwaki people in Iowa at the present moment? And the audience is curious too. Like, what sort of what are the political dilemmas that the community is grappling with at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's one where I would put forth to Meskwaki people to answer a question about the sort of dynamics either within the community or between their community and surrounding ones. Again, in the spirit of being kind of a constructive, reciprocal collaborator and partner. One of the lessons I've learned over the years is that, and it may not seem like it tonight, but to try to learn when it's appropriate to hold your tongue. And this is an area where I don't think it's my place to speak on. So. Sorry for whoever asked the question.
Please ask Eric more questions. Books are on sale. Books are being signed, and we can continue the conversation. Let's all give Eric a hand.
Thank you, Doug.